Good morning, everyone. My name is Justin Williams, and I'm a maple syrup producer from Prince Edward County, Ontario. For those of you that don't know where that's located, it's about 2 hours east of Toronto. We're actually a little island that sticks out in Lake Ontario. I'm here today to give you a tour of my maple syrup operation. On my farm here, we tap around 500 maple trees using exclusively pipeline with a vacuum system. So today I'm out in the forest to show you how we collect the sap. Then I will go into the building behind us here and show you the sap collection area. And then following that, we will move on up to the sugar house to show you how we process the sap. And then we will have anyone ask questions following that if they have any. So first off, we're going to start out here at the maple tree. I'll just turn my camera around. So here you can see a maple tree. This one here is probably about 150 years old. So every year we have to drill a hole into the tree. So you can see right here, I've drilled a small hole, and then I will attach a disposable spile to it. So I will tap that in gently with a small hammer, and then I will attach this pipeline to it. So this piece of pipe here is called a drop line. Through my forest, like I mentioned, I have all pipeline. So it first starts with a few little drops coming out of the tree here, flows down this line through this lateral line. And if we follow that on down, we'll head on down there. We can see the main line, and we'll see where the sap flows from the tree on through to our collection area. So basically, pipeline system in a forest for collecting sap is basically a spider web. It goes from tree to tree all the way through the woods, starting at this building right here, which is my pump house, spreading out throughout the woods. And so here you can see another maple tree with a drop line, and then it flows through this small line into the main line. The main line is basically the big trunk line that then will go back to the pump house. Unfortunately, today it's not flowing. In order for sap to flow, we need it to be above freezing during the day and below freezing at night. Last night it froze to about -10 here, and it's currently about -5 and windy. So unless it warms up quite a bit, probably won't get much sap today. So now we're gonna head on over to the pump house, and you can see where all these main lines flow into that building. We're currently on the back side of the building. So on my operation here, I currently have 5 main lines. So they stretch from one end of the forest right through to the other. And back here is where they all come through the wall into my pumping station. So we'll now head on inside, the pumping station, and we can see where all these lines go from there. We're now inside the pump house. So if you look back here, these are the 5 pipes that we just saw come through the wall on the other side. So they will all flow into this unit here, this big blue and clear unit. So it's called an extractor. So the reason we need this unit is on my farm, we have a vacuum system. So with the vacuum system, it helps take the sap from the trees on those slightly cooler days where it might not run under gravity, and draws it back to the pump house here. So this unit's job is to take the sap that you can actually see some down here right now that's still sitting in there from yesterday. It will take that and pump it out and it will pump it up to my sugar house where all my storage tanks are. And the advantages with the pipeline or with the vacuum system, we get a much higher yield of sap, and so it helps improve our production through the year. So that if you were to look in there while it was running, on each of those little spots in there, you would actually see sap shooting out of it a little bit. Unfortunately, today that's not happening, but you've probably seen some videos online of that happening. So there you can see how clear the sap actually is. When sap comes out of the tree, it's only 2% sugar. So it basically tastes like sweetened water. So now we're going to head up here, and I can show you my storage tanks that I have there, as well as we'll go into the sugar house, and we can see how I boil the sap down. So I just walked up from just down here. That is my pumping station. So from there, you can see two overhead black pipes here. One of those is used to create the suction down there, to create the vacuum on the whole pipeline system. And the other one is used to pump the sap up here. So currently it flows up through those lines, down through this green line. And I will open up this tank. And so this is lots of sap in here right now. So you can see how nice and clear the sap is. Like I mentioned before, it basically looks like water. So it takes about 40 liters of sap to get 1 liter of maple syrup. So that means for every bottle of syrup you were to buy, we have to process 40 more of those. And we're boiling off 39 liters minimum of water to get just that 1 liter of maple syrup. So as you can see, I've got lots of different tanks here. Those allow me on those days when it's running really well to be able to store lots of the sap. And these are all old milk tanks that came out of barns. And so they work really well because they keep the sap nice and cool, because sap is a perishable product. It degrades very quickly. So if the sap is too warm for too long, it will actually go bad and we're not able to use it to produce syrup anymore. So then this tank, we're going to go inside this building, which is a sugar house, and we're going to go into this little room right here, and we'll see where this tank comes into on the other side of the wall. Okay, so I just mentioned about that tank. So if you look through the window, you can see the tank. This is the valve right here for it. So it flows into this machine right here, which is called a reverse osmosis. So some of you may have a machine like this in your house. So the premise of it is the sap is pumped into these vessels here under high pressure, and it removes around 75% of the water even before we have to boil it. So the advantage with that is we're using a lot less wood and spending a lot less time boiling. So it takes the ratio from about 40 to 1 down to 10 to 1. So a lot of larger syrup producers now are starting to use this machine. So basically what it does is when it goes through this membrane that's inside of here, it separates it into two parts. One is pure water, which I store in here for cleaning purposes, and the other is concentrated sap, which then flows to the upper tank outside, and then it flows into my evaporator, and that's what I will then boil down to make the maple syrup. So people that have these much smaller units than these in their houses, they will actually drink the water and they'll be getting rid of the other stuff, where for us the water is a waste product and we're using the concentrated sap. So we're now going to head on into the sugar house and then we can see the evaporator. So back right there is where the sap flows from the upper tank through my evaporator. So an evaporator is a stainless steel machine that we use to boil down the sap. So in order to make syrup, we have to boil water out of it. So the sap first comes in the back here. It enters on the other side of this machine and there. So you kind of see in here, so up here are pipes that preheat the sap before it flows into the evaporator. If you look in here, you can see some channels go back and forth. So the sap in here will flow back and forth. As it gets up to here, this float box will then control the level for the front pans. So these front pans are called the finishing pans. So these are the pans where we're getting the final bit of water boiling out, as well as these are what cause the kind of caramelization and the colors of the syrup, the finished syrup. So then at the very front here, we've got this valve, which is an automatic draw-off valve. So the purpose of it is based on a temperature that I set, it will automatically open this valve and drain the finished unfiltered syrup down into these pails. So a lot of syrup producers will use these auto draw-off units because it basically you set it, and while you're doing other things, it will keep pumping. It'll just keep draining the sap or the syrup out. If syrup gets too far done, it will burn very quickly in these pans, and most syrup producers have done that and usually end up wrecking your pans. That's not a good thing. So here I boiled last night. I finished up about 4 o'clock. So you can see the inside of the pans look kind of gungy and things. That is just from the natural impurities in the sugar sands that separate out from the boiling process. It's kind of like if you take a pot of boiling water and boil it for a long period on your stove, you're going to end up with sediment separating out. So every day after we boil, we need to clean those out. And I will show you the kind of the filtering process and how we get the crystal clear syrup that you would see in the store. So down here, this is the firebox. So it's kind of hard to see in there, but that is where I put wood in. My evaporator is wood fired. In Ontario, most are either wood fired. There's a bit of oil and propane evaporators as well, but I use the wood method. So I use dead trees or trees that fall down in my forest. I cut those and split them, and I'm using those to boil down the sap to make syrup. So this unit, I can put about 1 meter long pieces of wood in, and every 10 minutes, I'm throwing about 8 to 10 pieces that long into here to keep the fire going, because we want a really hot fire for a length of time to be able to boil all the extra water out of the sap that we don't need in order to make the syrup. So as I mentioned before, we have the auto draw-off unit. So that's a valve here that drains the syrup into these pails. So what I do here is when these pails are getting full, I will then transfer them over to these 2 propane finishing pans I have. And then I use propane to do my finishing because that allows me a little bit more control, and I can watch over the very end to make sure that I'm not burning the syrup, or if I've gone a little too far on the evaporator, at this point I can add some sap back into it, because raw sap from the tree, you're looking at about 2% sugar, and finished syrup, you're at 66% sugar. So it's very important that we always meet that threshold, because if we are under, if we're not done enough, basically your concentrated sap, and that's when you can much more easily get mold on your bottles. And if you're overdone, you're going to get sugar crystals forming in your bottle. So if you see a newer bottle that has sugar crystals in it, it's often due to being over boiled, and then the syrup naturally wants to settle back out to get to that 66% sugar. So the main way we use to tell if the syrup is done is temperature. And then once we put it in here, I use this here, which is called a hydrometer. So basically the idea with it, I'll fill this little stainless steel cup up with syrup. I will put this in, and at almost boiling, if it's floating at this little red line here, that means that the syrup is done. So that's an easy way when you're boiling and syrup is still a little bit dirty to be able to check the density of the syrup. Or another way we do it is, and this one you can only use for finished syrup, but it's a refractometer. So the idea with this is we put a couple drops of syrup right on there, and then when we push the button here, it will read out and tell us a certain number, and we want to make sure that that is at 66% sugar. So once we've reheated the syrup and I'm sure that it is finished maple syrup, not concentrated sat or overdone, I will then connect up this hose to it, which then goes through this unit here, which is a pump, and then over through here, which is a filter press. So as I've mentioned, there's a lot of natural impurities and could be some leaves and things in the sap. We want to make sure that our syrup is crystal clear when we are done. So it'll go from there through this unit, which is a really fine filter that pushes it through under pressure. And then we'll go into this bottling unit. This bottling unit is water jacketed. So what that means is around the outside, there's water that we heat to almost boiling. And then the inside here is full of syrup. So it's kind of hard to see, but down in there, there's about 20 liters of syrup. And then from the front of it, we've got two different valves here that I can then use to fill my bottles. So you can see how nice and crystal clear that syrup is there. So this was syrup that I would have filtered yesterday at about 3 o'clock. So then another reason we use this bottling unit, or I use it in particular, is because you need to bottle the syrup above 180 degrees Fahrenheit. So as you can see, it's turned off right now. But we bottle syrup above 180 Fahrenheit. So that will sanitize the bottles as well as seal the caps on it. So especially any of these smaller bottles, I will also put them in a toaster oven to preheat the bottles first to make sure that they'll be sanitized and sealed. So then they should, in theory, have a shelf life of many years after they're bottled until they're opened. And unopened syrup can be stored on the shelf, but once not in the fridge. But once a bottle is open, then you need to be storing it in the fridge at minimum. Or I always tell them that if it's going to be in their fridge for a long time, to avoid the risk of potential spoilage, to just freeze it, and then that way when you go to use it again, just thaw it out. You're more than able to use it without the risk of it going bad. So from here, we'll then bottle it. So I do multiple ways. So these are 10-liter jugs here that I fill with syrup. So those would be for customers that use a whole lot, or some restaurants and things like that. I would sell them 10-liter sizes. Then I have these barrels, which are about 90 liters each. So as you can see, I've got 3 of those. So those ones I would use to generally, if I need to repackage syrup throughout the year, I would then take those, dump them into these propane units, reheat them, bring them up to almost boiling, run them through the filter press, and bottle them hot again. Or the retail size packaging I do is right here. So there you can see all the different sizes of bottles I do, as well as maple sugar and maple butter. So for those of you that don't know kind of how those other products are made, so basically I'll show you here. So this is maple butter, or maple spread, it's also called. So to make it, you heat the syrup to a higher temperature and you cool it to almost freezing. Then you're going to stir it in a special machine, and it's going to come out in this creamy, really yummy texture. So people will put those on pancakes sometimes, on crepes. They taste really good. Just a piece of toast, and just spread that on after you make your toast. And then this is granular maple sugar. So it's kind of a sugar substitute, basically. So this is the way that syrup was originally made before we had containers that we could store the maple syrup in for long periods of time, as it is a perishable product. So to make this, I basically boil it to 260 degrees Fahrenheit, so much higher than boiling point, as boiling is around 212 Fahrenheit. So I heat it to a much higher temperature, and then I put it in either a food processor or a KitchenAid mixer or a bigger size, and actually mix it. And as you're mixing it, it turns into these granules that you can use as a sugar substitute to either put in your coffee if you like a little bit of sweetening up in your coffee, or in baking. You can put it in that, and it gives you a little hint of flavor of maple syrup. So this is just kind of a view around the sugar house again. So if anyone has any questions, I could take some questions now. Okay, so the first question, how many trees do I tap? So I have about 500 taps in, but that being said, there's about 300 trees I tap. So on larger trees, I'm able to tap, put multiple spiles in the trees, where the smaller trees around 30 centimeters diameter, I will only put one tap in that size of tree. So around 500 taps on 300 trees. So I guess that kind of ties into this next question of the rule of thumb is about 30 centimeters or 12 inches. And usually for a tree in a forest to get to that size, it's around 50 years of age. So generally people aren't planting trees to be able to tap them. They're going to be natural forests that are already there, or if you are planting trees, it's going to be either for your kids, your children, or grandchildren to tap down the road. So maple trees are the ones that produce maple syrup. So sugar maples would be the most common. Some people will also tap red maples. There's quite a few different types of maple trees, but in order to get maple syrup, it's only going to be from maple trees. And to add to that a little bit, when you see 100% pure maple syrup, there is nothing else in the syrup other than the sap that was boiled down. So there's no additives or anything added to it. It's only the sap that's been boiled down. So tapping, especially if you're tapping a small tree, it will slow the growth down a little bit. There's been some quite extensive research done on that out of Cornell and other areas in the US, that you will stunt the growth about 5%. So that's why we recommend tapping larger trees, because it will 5% of growth on a large tree isn't going to affect them as much as a small tree. That being said, we are now using conservative tapping techniques. So for example, we're putting less taps in each tree. We're finding we're still getting the same volume of sap out of them. As well, we also are using smaller holes. So we used to be using about 7/16 diameter taps. I'm not even sure what that is in metric. And now we're about 5/16 diameter, and some people are even using down to 1/4 inch. So that basically within about 2 years, we should see the tap holes healed up on the trees. Yes, that's right. There is, most trees do produce sap of some sort. Maple is definitely the sweetest that I'm aware of. Some people I know are tapping walnut and birch. Those are generally later in the spring, kind of when maple is done. From my understanding, I've never had either of those syrups, but they are not quite as sweet as maple is. So on my farm here, we actually run a 75 cow dairy farm. So I work full time on my parent dairy farm the rest of the year. And during the springtime is when I'm pretty much exclusively down in the forest here producing maple syrup. So as I mentioned before, the maple syrup season is when temperatures are above freezing during the day and below freezing at night. So this year we started about middle of February, and excuse me, we're not sure when the season's going to end. Basically, once the temperature stays too warm for too long above freezing, then our season's over. Unfortunately, going into each season, we don't really know how many days the season will be. I've had some where it's about 2 weeks, and I've had other seasons where it's around 2 months. So where it's 100% dependent on Mother Nature. When Mother Nature decides it's going to warm up in the spring and stay warm, then our season is done. And especially once the buds come out, which form the leaves on the trees, the sap will turn bitter. And at that point, the sap is no good for syrup production because any off flavors in your sap gets concentrated in your syrup. So it will be a much stronger flavor once you make your maple syrup. So the biggest difficulties with making maple syrup is the weather. We are 100% dependent on Mother Nature to provide us with the sap. So there's not much we can do. Well, there's nothing we can do to control the weather. And the only control we have is when watching the forecast. When the weather is ready, then we need to be ready to start collecting the sap. As I mentioned earlier, having the vacuum system will help increase the yields a little bit. But even with that, if the weather is not cooperating and not warm enough, we're still not able to collect sap. So I did take a 2-year diploma program at the University of Guelph Kentville campus. That was actually focused more on the dairy side of the farming. About 25 years ago, a friend of mine and we started tapping some trees on his property. And then we started looking at the woods here behind my parents' house and started seeing how many maples there was here. Within the maple industry, we're all a really close-knit community. So basically the best way to find out things is to ask questions and talk to different people, and a lot of trial by fire. So basically, yeah, just giving things a shot. Usually people start out at a small operation. Like when I first started tapping, I had around 20 trees, and now I'm up to the 300 trees with 500 taps. So yeah, just talking to different people and making connections and asking questions and finding those people that are willing to answer those questions for you. So the lines are small enough that I've never actually seen animals in the lines, but that being said, I do leave my pipeline up year round, and squirrels do love to run along the pipes and chew on them. And this last year, I even had coyotes decide to come through and chew on the line. So squirrels, even through the season, because the sap is so sweet, they love to chew little holes in the pipe. And under a vacuum system, that really affects your yield of sap. And then the coyotes, when they come in, they just take big bites and they'll actually cut your pipes right in half. So the start of the year this year, I actually had quite a bit of damage that I had to go through and fix, but that's pretty normal to have damage throughout the season or at the start of the season. And the advantage with the pipeline over the over the pail system is pails are less work at the start and the end of the season, but every day it's running, you have to go out to collect the sap. Where with pipeline system, I have a lot of work ahead of, a little bit during, and a lot after for cleanup. but otherwise the sap comes to me through the pipeline. So on really good running days, if I need to be up here boiling the sap, then I don't have to be worried about my pails overflowing, because with all the work and effort we put into collecting the sap, we don't want it to be running on the ground. So I am mostly a one-person operation. My wife does help with sales, and currently my parents is kind of the retail spot, because there's generally always someone around the farm here. So people will stop in and buy syrup from there. And then last weekend and the next 2 weekends in March, I'm part of a maple open house in Prince Edward County here. So with that, I'll usually have 1 or 2 other people down here helping. And then didn't really touch on it, but I go through about 5 cord of wood every year. So you can see all this wood out here. So I'm going to probably burn through all of this wood yet this year. And so that's a lot of cutting and splitting and time to do that. So I'm not able to do that by myself. So my father-in-law, he will actually come down and help me with that. So generally I kind of call in people as needed. So my product is called Justin's Maple Syrup. So I believe at the end, yeah, there we go. justinsmaple.ca is my website. And through that, you can purchase my product. And I do shipping across Canada, as well as if you are local to the Prince Edward County area, we do kind of curbside pickup. So you can go on there, order your product, pay, and then we will leave it sitting out for you to stop in my parents' porch to pick up the product. When the bottles of syrup are opened, then they need to be refrigerated. But if the bottle is sealed, so like the retail bottles, when they're still sealed, those can sit out, do not need to be refrigerated as long as they were sealed properly. So that means being heated, the syrup and bottle being heated to at least 100 degrees, 180 degrees Fahrenheit prior to bottling, and maintaining that for a minimum of 5 minutes. Then the bottles are able to sit out. But once you open the bottles, or other maple products such as maple butter, those do need to be refrigerated, or you can also freeze them as well. Syrup is a perishable product, so it will go bad over time if it does sit out. That being said, like while you're having breakfast, it can sit out for that and then put it back in the fridge after that time. So that's a very good question. I didn't really touch on the grades of syrup. So I'm just going to turn you around again, and there's a so here's a chart. Thank you for that question. There's golden across the world right now. This is the standardized system. So there's golden, amber, dark, and very dark. So here you can see golden, amber, dark, and very dark. So generally, earlier on in the season, we're going to be producing the lighter syrups. So far this year, I've been producing mostly amber, but actually just yesterday, I started producing some golden. So generally, earlier in the season, lighter color, not as strong a maple flavor, and later in the season, you're going to get darker colors and a stronger, more robust maple flavor. My favorite grade of maple syrup would be dark. I love the strong, robust flavor and the dark color that it provides. But it's all personal preference. People, when they come to buy my product, they'll ask me what's the best, and I say it's up to you. So during open houses, I always have syrup that people can sample, and they can give it a try and see if that's kind of the grade they like, or if they prefer a different grade of maple syrup. Maple syrup is can be used on a lot of things. As I mentioned earlier, if you like crepes, you can do that, or waffles. I've over the years have gone through 3 waffle makers because I love waffles that much that I actually wear them out. So waffles, if you like sugar in your coffee, you need to put maple syrup or maple sugar in your coffee. And baking, you can substitute it in for sugar. Generally, I recommend using maple sugar as a sugar substitute in baking. Otherwise, you've got a lot, they can be very moist and wet when you're done cooking them. It's so versatile, even ice cream. I often have ice cream and put a little bit of maple syrup on that. On your ham, if you're cooking a ham, you can drizzle in some maple syrup. It also tastes good on like boiled carrots. Put a little bit of maple syrup on that, or even like caramelizing onions. Throw a little bit of syrup on that at the end. There really isn't anything, I think, that maple syrup is not good for or good to go on. Favorite thing about being a maple syrup producer, I would say, is talking to my customers. I enjoy sharing how we produce maple syrup, talking to them about the different ways they like to use maple syrup, as well as I love talking to my customers. I often get in trouble because I talk for too long sometimes with people, but I would just say the connections and talking to people. And I always joke that I had to start producing maple syrup because it was costing my parents too much to be able to buy it. So I often say I'm my best customer because I would go through the most out of all of my customers. So March Maple Madness is a weekend festival happening throughout March. So every weekend in March. And I don't know if this is going to be the right way. I think they'll post a website at the end. So right here, actually. So currently there's 60 businesses that are participating in it, from maple syrup producers through wineries, as well as accommodations. So basically it's open house every weekend in March happening in Prince Edward County. And all the sugar bushes and other businesses that are listed will have open houses, or some of the wineries will have maple inspired tastings or meals that you can go and try. So as I mentioned, there's still this coming weekend in March and the last weekend in March. So if you're interested, check out the website and you can find out more information. And it's a pretty sweet time. So there are other maple syrup events outside of Prince Edward County. There's currently 2 festivals that happen within Prince Edward County, but outside there is Maple Weekend, it's called. So that is through the Ontario Maple Syrup Producers Association. So if you Google that, you can find, Maple Weekend. So that is the first weekend of April, I believe it is. And so there's sugar bushes from all across Ontario that are a part of an open house that weekend. So you can check those out, as well as other areas. They would have, most counties now, I believe, have some sort of maple syrup festival. So if you just try Googling it, you should find maple syrup festivals. A lot of them are yet to happen. They're generally kind of the end of March to the beginning of April, as most places in Ontario are still producing syrup during that time. Well, thanks everyone for the following me along in syrup production today. I hope you enjoyed the tour, and I hope everyone has a great day. Cheers.